Good evening, all. This evening I wanted to discuss the second of Rod Serling's anthology series, which was Night Gallery, or otherwise known as Rod Serling's Night Gallery, which aired on NBC from December 1970 to May 1973. There were 43 episodes, a great number of which, the teleplays at least, were written by Rod Serling, though they were principally based on the stories of other writers. A few of them were originals, but not too many. One of them, notably, was They're Tearing Down Tim Riley's Bar, which was nominated for but did not win an Emmy for the Outstanding Teleplay of 1973. Very good episode starring William Wyndham. But it originated with a movie, which was 3 segments, each about 20-25 minutes long, which included the directorial premiere of a guy you may know by the name of Steven Spielberg. And no, I'm not kidding. He really did direct one. He actually directed 2 episodes. He directed another one later on. But the one he is famous for is Eyes with Joan Crawford. And that's the second of the series, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Unlike the Twilight Zone, Night Gallery was not a science fiction series. It was primarily horror and supernatural. Originally, Serling was going to call it Witches, Werewolves, and Warlocks, but thought that was a little too corny. And he came up with the idea of introducing each of the stories with a painting. The paintings in the movie were done by a guy named Jaroslav Jerry Gelb, who was a Hungarian painter. And then in the series, they were done by Tom Wright, who went on to be a director, and he directed episodes of The X-Files and a lot of other shows. And the paintings apparently all still exist, and if you can find one, they're like rare, valuable collector's items, because a lot of them were actually destroyed by NBC, unfortunately, after the series was done. They didn't really understand that they might have any sort of value once the series was over. The first 2 series were 50 minutes, and then the third and final series was reduced to 25 minutes. Serling did not produce this series. He left the producing duties to Jack Laird for seasons 1 and 2 and William Sackheim for season 3. And he also he hired more guest writers and more. Each episode was directed by a different director. Which includes Leonard Nimoy's directorial debut for the episode Death on a Barge, which is one of my favorites, starring the beautiful Leslie Warren. And really quite a good story. I'll go into some of these later. I'm not obviously, since there are 43 episodes, I'm not going to go into each and every single one. I don't remember each and every single one, even though I looked them up on Google, just to kind of give myself a refresher. But I knew already which episodes I really liked and which ones I thought were kind of eh. One of the things that they did that Serling objected to was, in the second series, they injected what they're called blackout segments. These blackout segments were little comedy bits, and sometimes they were as short as 4 to 5 minutes, sometimes they were like 15 minutes. And he thought that broke up what they were trying to do. That he said it this way: you can't show Edgar Allan Poe for an hour and then show Flip Wilson for 43 seconds. No, it doesn't make any sense. And he thought that they broke up the seriousness of the episodes, and I tend to agree. I didn't like a lot of they were mostly pretty stupid, high school kind of humor. Didn't really add anything to the episodes. In fact, detracted from some of them. He also didn't like the fact that in the third series they moved it from Wednesday night at 10 p.m. to Sunday at 10 p.m. when basically nobody watches TV, on Sunday at 10 p.m. Or if they were watching, The Wonderful World of Disney, that kind of stuff. He said again that they were trying to kill the episode, to kill the series, deliberately. Said that the corporate heads were messing with his creation, which they did. It was all in color, unlike the Twilight Zone. There are a lot of great guest stars, too many to list, but really great. John Astin was in a number of them, and Joanna Pettit, and Joanne Linville, and Elsa Lanchester, And I could go on and on. William Wyndham was in one of the, like I said, where they're tearing down Tim Riley's Bar, which was nominated for an Emmy. That one was written by Serling, and he said it was one of the finest things he ever wrote, and I tend to agree. Great, interesting, suspenseful, some of them were very scary, very well done, really good, cinematography and direction and editing. And again, Serling wrote a great number of the total 43. But it started out with a movie which I believe was about an hour and 25 minutes, and 3 segments, and each of the segments is really good. The first, let me read of Serling's introduction, because I think it was really brilliant, and I liked it. He says, "Good evening and welcome to a private showing of 3 paintings, displayed here for the first time. Each is a collector's item in its own way, not because of any special artistic quality, but because each captures on canvas, suspended in time and space, a frozen moment of a nightmare." Again, that's a great intro, and I thought that was really, brilliant. All of his introductions were really quite good, as they were on the Twilight Zone. And again, each one accompanied a painting or a sculpture. There were some sculptures too. The first section of the movie is called the Graveyard, and the Cemetery. I'm sorry, and it stars Roddy McDowall. And just briefly, he is a person who's killed his rich uncle for his money, and he starts. His uncle had this kind of bizarre painting. It was a painting of his own tombstone, and as he's starting to enjoy using the money and going out and spending and having wild nights, he keeps coming back, and the painting's changed, and slowly it starts showing like the coffin rising out of the grave, and then the coffin lid opening, and his uncle coming out of the coffin and coming towards the house. And each time he like walks out of the room, he comes back in and it's changed, and he's like starts freaking out. And the final one, he hears somebody knocking on the door, and the painting shows his uncle's moldering corpse knocking on the door, and he drops dead of a heart attack. And it turns out that his servant Portafoy had been doing that. He had these paintings all hidden in the closet, and he would just put a different one up each day. He was trying again to get him to drop dead because he's the next person in line in the inheritance. Then, unbeknownst to Portafoy, he starts seeing Roddy McDowall coming out of the grave, and that kind of ends the episode. Very good, I thought, very creepy. The paintings were fantastic in that. Again, done by, in this case, Jaroslav Geber, Geber. And the second one is the best one, I think. It's called Eyes. And it stars principally Joan Crawford and Tom Bosley. And it's about a very rich, kind of nasty, blind woman who is told by her doctor that there's a new operation that can give her sight, but only for 12 hours. It's very expensive, and he has to have a volunteer to give his eyes up, and that's Tom Bosley, who plays a guy who's very put upon. He owes money to the mob, and if he agrees to donate his eyes, as it were, to Joan Crawford, they'll give him the money so he can pay off the mob. And that kind of closes out that segment. Joan Crawford eventually undergoes the operation and has Tom Bosley's eyes implanted into her, and wakes up and can't see anything, doesn't understand. She's woken up in the middle of the New York blackout. And so she's basically went through all this and paid all this money and basically sacrificed a man's life for nothing. And she eventually stumbles and falls out the window. That's the one that was directed by Steven Spielberg, and he did a really good job in that. Top notch. The third episode is called Escape Clause, and in it a very nasty former Nazi who's hiding in Argentina, played by Richard Kiley, is being pursued by Mossad agents with the help of Sam Jaffe, who was one of his former victims, and he's desperate to escape. One of the things he likes to do is he likes to go to this museum and look at this painting of a fisherman, and for some reason that painting soothes him or relaxes him. And as he's finally tracked down by the Mossad agents and he's being chased through the streets, he runs into the museum and he basically begs God, says, please, please, God, take me up into the painting. Well, unbeknownst to him, the museum switched out the paintings, and the painting that he's taken up into is a horrible depiction of a Holocaust victim being crucified, and now it has his face. That was, again, a very good, very frightening episode, which, again, this, bade well for the coming series. Unfortunately, it was very hit and miss. Some of the episodes that I liked, and again, notably, these are ones that where Serling wrote the teleplays, include, and I'll tell you some others. Camera Obscura, which had Rene Auberjonois in it, was very good, and Ross Martin, I should say. The Caterpillar, which starred, come on, Lawrence Harvey and Joanna Pettit, again. Very memorable episode. That's the one people tend to remember better than any of the others. Class of 99 was very good. Cool Air, which is an adaptation of H.P. Lovecraft's story of the same title. Very faithful adaptation, I should say. The Doll, which is one of the other ones that people remember. Green Fingers, which was the one with Elsa Lancaster. Lindeman's Catch, was about a mermaid. The Messiah on Mott Street, which is a very good, interesting story, somewhat based on a Bernard Malamud short story called Angel, I believe. They're tearing down Tim Bradley's bar. Some of the other ones that I liked that were not written by Serling, The Boy Who Predicted Earthquakes with Clint Howard. That was really good. Pickman's Model, which again is based on the H.P. Lovecraft story and follows fairly closely, although they made a few little changes, which I understand. I'll go into that a little bit more later. The Return of the Sorcerer, based on the story by Clarke Ashton Smith, who was a contemporary and a correspondent of Lovecraft. Silent Snow, Secret Snow, one that I liked. Brenda, another one that I liked. The Girl with the Hungry Eyes, I really loved, based on the Fritz Lieber short story of the same name. And again, a very fairly faithful adaptation. A few changes were made, but I liked the changes. They worked. And I'll discuss that episode a little more in depth, too. Certain Shadows on the Wall, it's okay. It had Agnes Moorehead in it. It's not great. The Hand of Borges Weems, again, an interesting episode. Sins of the Father, with Richard Thomas, is one of the best ones. About a phenomenon that was actually a real phenomenon called a sin eater, and what they had to do, and some rather horrific consequences. Death on a Barge, that says the one with Leslie Ann Warren, and directed by Leonard Nimoy in his directorial debut. The Other Way Out is a very chilling episode, and very good. There were some other, decent episodes, but again, a lot of these other were these like little, comedy bits, and I don't really think, I think that detracted from the overall ethic of the show by putting these things in. I think Serling was right to object to those, but because he didn't have as much creative control, he really couldn't say very much about it. His hands were tied. He wasn't pleased with the overall series. It did fairly well in the ratings, but wasn't renewed after the third series, and Serling basically washed his hands of it. The next thing, and I believe the last thing that he ever did, of course, was the opening narration for Brian De Palma's brilliant cult classic, Phantom of the Paradise. And if you haven't seen that, you should. Reviewing some of the episodes that I liked, people seem to really love The Caterpillar with Lawrence Harvey. Lawrence Harvey plays a jealous husband who believes that his wife, Joanna Pettit, is having an affair on him with Tom Sizemore, I think is the other actor. And so what he does is he has gone to Indonesia and discovered a thing called an earwig, which supposedly, once it's placed in your ear, will burrow its way through your brain. And the only way to prevent it from doing this is to keep absolutely still. If you move for even a moment, it will basically eat your brain and drive you insane. And the guy he plants it in is like completely freaked out. And finally, at the end of the episode, he escapes the torture. Somehow it goes out of his ear, and now he's saved. And the irony is that it was a female and it laid eggs in his brain. That's really, really scary. I thought that was really well done. And people seem to remember the other one's somewhat like Camera Obscura, is about a moneylender played by Rene Auberjonois, who gets his comeuppance due to this strange camera that Ross Martin has that somehow predicts the future and allows him to see what's going to happen. The Boy Who Predicted Earthquakes with Clint Howard is one of my favorites, even though it contains a scientific inaccuracy, and I'll explain that. He plays a boy who's a psychic, and he can indeed do things like predict earthquakes and storms and disasters. And one day, he does this on television, on a television program. And one day he tells his mother, I don't want to do this anymore. I can't do it anymore. She says, what do you mean you can't do it? He's about to go on. And he says, I can't do it today. I just can't do it. I want to go home. And he's a little boy, so she says, oh, okay, we'll take you home, and you don't have to do it today. But you need to tell me why, what happened. And she keeps cajoling him, and eventually he says, that book on astronomy you showed me? And she says, yes. He says, well, you showed me a certain page about what happens to stars sometimes. And she says, what do you mean? She says, well, when a star starts to die. And she says, you mean a nova? And he says, yes. And she says, well, what does that have to do with you not wanting to go on the show? He says, that's what's going to happen to the sun today, or tomorrow, he says. And she just hugs him at the end. Well, like I said, there's a slight, and I don't fault the producers or director for not knowing this. K-class yellow dwarf stars like the sun do not go supernova or nova. They just eventually fade out. Some will eventually flare into a red giant, destroy the Earth and its other planets, but it will eventually just fade into nothing. It won't explode the way that a supernova would. And that's not going to happen for 5 billion years, folks, so don't worry about it. Some others that I like, Green Fingers is about a woman played by Elsa Lanchester who refuses to sell her property to a greedy land developer. And eventually, he resorts to violence, murders her, and buries her in her garden, and finds to her chagrin that people with she had a green thumb, what accompanies green thumb, green fingers, that she actually grows back as a plant the plant grows back into her. So he can't get rid of her that easily. I thought that was clever. I thought that was a good episode. Let's see, Cool Air. It's about a guy who is basically terrified of heat of any kind. He lives in a refrigerated house and refuses to. There's a woman who loves him, played by Barbara Rush, who he refuses to leave this environment for any reason. And when she finally can cajole, his air conditioner starts to break down, and he panics, calls a repairman, and the repairman doesn't get there on time. And I won't spoil the ending for you, but it's very shocking. The reason that he really couldn't leave. The Doll is a very good episode about Indian colonialism and revenge. Again, I won't spoil that for those who haven't seen it. Pickman's Model is one of my absolute favorites. It stars Bradford Dillman, and it's about a man, Richard Upton Pickman, and this woman falls in love with him, and it takes place in Victorian Boston, and he has been shunned from his artistic society because he has a penchant for drawing paintings of ghouls being creatures that eat the dead, and he draws these in graphic detail, and it just horrifies his compatriots to the point that they eject him from their society. He has taken up residence in a very bizarre sort of basement studio in Boston's East End somewhere, in a very poor neighborhood. And the woman who, I think it's Louise Fletcher actually, who loves him, is trying to understand why he keeps coming here and what's so important. It has something to do with a cistern in the basement, and again, I won't spoil that, but there's again a very shocking end to that one, which is very similar to what happens in Lovecraft's original story. The Return of the Sorcerer is by Clarke Ashton Smith. And it's about a man who is hired to translate Bill Bixby is hired to translate a Sumerian tablet by Vincent Price, who is the brother of a sorcerer who died, and he doesn't tell him how he died. And as he recites this tablet, slowly over a period of days, his brother's body parts start to coalesce back into his brother, who comes back for revenge. I thought that was really, really good and really scary. Very well done, a very good adaptation again. Silent Snow, Secret Snow is about a little boy who's sort of obsessed with snow and enters into a sort of a fantasy world. And that has some interesting things in it too, which again I won't spoil. Brenda, about a shy girl who befriends a kind of a monster that lives in her garden and uses it as sort of to exact her revenge on people who were mean to her. The Girl with the Hungry Eyes, which again stars Joanna Pettit and James Fiorentino, is a really good adaptation of the short story by Fritz Lieber about this artist, or photographer rather, who discovers this model who's an absolute knockout, and she has very strange eyes, and she just appears one day, and she has these rules that he can use her for photographs for anything he wants. He can photograph her anytime she comes over, but he can't ask her anything about her personal life. He can't meet her. He is not allowed to date her or to, think about her in any way other than the fact that she's just a model, and can't tell anybody about her. Well, he agrees to, and she said, if you don't agree to that, forget it. And he says, okay. And he agrees. He has to pay her in cash also. And he says, okay. He agrees to it. And soon she becomes very, very popular. Everybody wants to use her when they start seeing the ads that he's running with her. This head of a beer company, who I believe is played by John Aston, wants to use her as his munch a beer girl, and does, and the beer starts selling like crazy. And he insists on knowing where she lives, that he wants to date her, and the photographer tells her, I don't know, she never told me, and that's one of the things that she made me, so he waits for her outside the studio and follows her into a park, and for some reason, while they're just talking, they don't really do anything, he just drops dead. And she's connected apparently with these things that the police are referring to as the maybe murders, because they don't know that these people are showing up and they seem to be like drained of all their life energy, and they can't explain it at all. And the photographer starts to think that maybe she's some sort of a vampire, but she doesn't drain people of blood, she drains them of life. And he becomes very afraid that she's going to start doing this to him, and she does kind of start doing it to him. And in order to stop her, he burns all of her photographs, and when he does this, she vanishes, and that basically destroys her. She only existed in the photographs, and that's not in the story, but I thought that was a really good adaptation, and I thought that was really, really well done. Let's see, which other ones are going to do. The Sins of the Father, which stars Richard Thomas, of all people, yes, John Boy, as a sin eater. And what a sin eater was supposed to do, they would prepare a huge meal for him, and he had to eat everything. And what he was actually doing was eating the sins of his father, which are then visited on him. And he is doing this, and he's being horribly tortured, and you just see him writhing in horrible agony. Really quite an affecting and scary episode. And again, Richard Thomas did a really, really good job in that. Death on a Barge is about a guy who falls in love with this woman who appears on this barge on a canal, and she won't leave the barge at any point. And eventually he comes to realize that she's a vampire, but he doesn't care. He loves her anyway. And I thought that was kind of an interesting romantic episode. As I said, it's Leonard Nimoy's directorial debut, and he did quite a good job. The Other Way Out is a very scary episode about a murderer who is kidnapped by one of his victims' fathers, and he's trapped in this basement full of booby traps, and tells him, never forget there is one other way out. Well, the other way out is suicide. That's the option that he's forced to take at the end of the episode. Again, some great episodes, a couple of silly ones. There's one that I actually like with Carl Reiner called The Last Class of Professor Peabody, where Professor Peabody, played by Carl Reiner, is a college professor, and he's teaching a class on H.P. Lovecraft and his Cthulhu mythos. And he's calling it nonsense, and, this is all made up, and, people shouldn't believe that this is real. One of the students says, "Oh, you shouldn't say that." And he says, "Oh, don't be ridiculous. Yog-Sothoth, Cthulhu, they aren't real. Ea and Hastur." He said, "Oh, don't say those words," whatever. And at the end of the class, he's turned into a monster. I thought that was pretty, interesting. But again, the series was okay, but the tone kept shifting. They couldn't, I think it's one of those things where they couldn't decide whether it was fish or fowl, whether they wanted it to be strictly a horror and or supernatural thriller, or whether they wanted it to be a comedy or drama, or the other outstanding episode really is that they're tearing down Tim Riley's bar, which starred William Wyndham in one of his best roles, other than Matt Decker in Star Trek. He plays a failed ad executive who spends his time in a bar called Tim Riley's, and he's constantly sort of taking these nostalgic trips into the past and remembering what life was, and he finds out that they're going to demolish this bar and put up something else, and he's very upset and doesn't want it done, and it's really quite affecting, very well done. Serling had a tendency to write episodes about put-upon executives, such as Gart Williams in A Stop at Willoughby from The Twilight Zone, the guy who was in A World of His Own, which is another episode about a put-upon executive. The World of Arthur Curtis, Private World of Arthur Curtis is another one. Somewhat, one could even argue that the character played by Pat Hingle in The Incredible World of Horace Ford, although he's not an executive, he's a toy maker, but again, he's put upon, he's being pressured by his peers, and he escapes into a fantasy, and that seems like, it seems to me that the person, and of course, the other one that is, oh, come on, why am I I'm drawing a blank, but Walking Distance, of course, was the other one where, again, an executive wants to escape into his childhood he thought was idyllic, and he didn't remember that it really wasn't. That, again, is a similar theme to The Incredible World of Horace Ford. But again, I think this is really about Serling himself. He's the put-upon executive who wanted to escape, and I think he wrote that into many things, including they're tearing down Tim Riley's bar. Anyway, these episodes are worth watching. They are available on DVD and Blu-ray. I do not believe they're available on streaming, but I do recommend them. Not as highly as The Twilight Zone or even Phantom of the Paradise, but I would say, good but not great. B-.